Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you may be joining us. I'm Avi Staiman, and I'm the founder and CEO of Academic Language Experts. Welcome to our second Publish My Paper, Ask the Expert session, where we answer your most pressing publication questions. As we get settled in, I encourage you to check in via the chat and introduce yourself. Tell us your name, location, and area of research so we can get to know each other a little bit better. Now, I'm delighted to once again introduce you to my co-host, Gareth Dyke, Director of Global Content at Research Square. Gareth, great to be back with you again today.
Yeah, it's nice to see everybody. Great to be back. Great to have the chance to do this again. Good to see so many people joining us. And absolutely, Jahi, sorry for my pronunciation, is asking, I'm wondering to know if this recorded session can be uploaded and shared. We'll be sharing the recording, right, Avi, with everybody?
Very much so, very much so. So not to worry, you'll get a recording. So if you miss anything, you're welcome to be in touch. We are going to be discussing how to find research gaps and construct a compelling research question today. So that's really the topic. Both Gareth and I have been working in the field of author services, or in other words, helping scholars to publish their research for over 25 years and have guided thousands of submissions, reviews, rewrites, revisions, critique, and edits, and held researchers' hands throughout the tears of rejection and the triumph of success. We will not leave here until all of your questions are answered, even if we are here for an entire day and cannot leave to go use the toilet. No, I'm exaggerating, but we will be here until you are done asking all of your questions. Don't be shy, and feel free to either raise your hand or submit a question via the chat. You can also send us a direct private chat if you want your question answered anonymously. And again, we will be sending out the recording over the next few days. So, Gareth, just to get us started here, because I know that we want to give some context to this meeting and to what we're going to be discussing today, I want to provide you with the following scenario, okay? And I want you to maybe think about how the researcher could have done things differently. So here's the scenario. Here's the story. I'm a researcher of molecular biology. I've spent a lot of time building out my research, conducting the studies in the lab, writing up my research. Maybe I got help with editing services to send it out. And I sent it to the publisher, and I get a review which says that what I'm doing is not that novel or is not using the right methodology, okay? And this is something that I know I see quite often and fairly often. And I think that can maybe, of all the reviews that we can get, is the most difficult, because it's like, well, what do you want me to do now, right? So what I'd like to set as our goal for today is, how do we, as researchers, how can we get to that point, or make sure we don't get to the point where we're getting that kind of feedback? How do we ensure from the outset that what we're doing is really impactful, really important, really novel, so that when we get to the stage of review, we're not going to be faced with this, well, you're not doing anything new, so it's not, we're not going to accept your article.
Well, the most important, you're right, that's a common problem, and we see that also in reviews that come back. But I think that we need to take a step back from that stage of the process, and that's the reason that we're having this discussion today, to think at the very beginning of the research process. So to answer your question, the way to avoid that kind of thing happening is to carefully plan your projects from the outset and think carefully about your research questions before you begin a research project. And that's why it's so important to think about what your question is and how that question fits into a knowledge gap that's not just interesting for you. And of course, you're a researcher working in a particular field, so you're going to find anything or many things about that particular field interesting, even those small incremental advances. But the trick here is to come up with questions that are going to be bigger, that are going to be more interesting, that make more of a step forward. So that's why it's important, and that's why we're talking today about thinking about your research question in the context of how it advances not just your field, but potentially a larger, wider question that more than just researchers in your own specific narrow area are going to find interesting. And that's what's happening when reviewers are coming back and saying, well, this is kind of okay, but it's just a small incremental step forward. It's not something that's gonna, set the world on fire. It's not something that we really are gonna want to publish in our journal. So that's the trick, and that's why we're having this discussion today. So yeah, let's talk more about that. I think that's really important.
So you used the term knowledge gap. So
Right.
can you help define for us what that means? First of all, how do you look at knowledge gaps?
Yeah.
And maybe, talk about, like, here's the way I see it, and let me know. I'm curious to hear if you see it the same way. Most researchers choose an area of study not because they've mapped out every single area of research and said this is the most understudied, this what needs to be researched. Usually we get into a field because we love it, because we connect to it, because it's important to us, because we find it meaningful, because we're good at it. And then all of a sudden we have those things that we're really interested in, right? And that we really care about. And then all of a sudden we're told, well, what you're interested in is great, but it actually needs to fill this knowledge gap, right? So what does that mean? And how do I bridge the gap, no pun intended, between what I care about, what I want to do, and what, interests me, and where the field is at and what's missing, and how do I kind of put that all together?
Okay, so a knowledge gap, just as the name suggests, is a piece of missing information in a particular field. Okay, and we can all sit down with a piece of paper or whatever and write down many, many, many things that we'd like to know in our own field. And they could be big or small or incremental, like things that are unknown in our own particular research area. Those are knowledge gaps. And the point of doing literature work when you start with a PhD project, or when you start with a research project, is of course to not just identify those knowledge gaps, but also determine what the field and beyond the field are going to find interesting and important about those gaps in knowledge. So there's two parts to this. First of all, questions and determining where work should be focused within a particular field, identifying those gaps in our knowledge. And then you've got to determine whether those gaps in knowledge are achievable, how much money you have to spend, or how much time or energy you'd have to spend to answer those questions. Many knowledge gaps that you can identify in your field will just not be achievable within a certain time frame or given a particular budget. And then thinking wider than that, like whether those questions will be of interest to other researchers in your field and beyond. And that's the key here. If you want to get your work published in those really high impact factor international journals, then you have to take your knowledge gaps, make them achievable and also interesting for larger groups of researchers. And this, by the way, is also the trick to writing successful grant applications, like having something that's interesting and achievable and of broad interest. And I know it's difficult. I mean, this is something that we spend a lot of time working with researchers on so that they can overcome these barriers and determine how they're going to take those steps forward with their research questions so that not only will they be publishable, but they'll be publishable in high impact factor journals. It comes with experience, I would say. As you get further on in your career and you work more in a particular field, you just get better at determining where your energy and effort would be focused. And so that's why we have supervisors when we work on our PhDs and master's theses, because the job of the supervisor is to direct, and guide you into those areas, those knowledge gaps that are worthwhile for you to spend your time and department money, So yeah, this is a really interesting fundamental part of planning and building a research project, like determining where the gaps are and whether you can fill them and whether they'll be interesting for other researchers. So
now I want to get to the question of how do we formulate a research question, because I think that's really important. But before we do that, I just want to one more clarification about the research gap. And that is, there are different kinds of fields, right? And some fields are very small, and there's 2 or 3 journals in the field. And so long as we're up to date on those journals, we pretty much know what's going on. But there are fields, especially once we start getting into interdisciplinary research, where just to keep up and to create and to know what exists and what doesn't exist, and especially once we take into account other languages, maybe there's research that's published in other languages that we don't know about. How do we even know, how do we even go about, making for ourselves a list of research gaps? How do we even know what research is out there? How do we, I think the golden word is curate, right? Like, how do we go from the thousands of results that we get when we do a search and boil it down to really those articles and papers and books that are going to be most relevant to my research, so that I can actually make an intelligent determination and say, okay, I know I'm 99.5% confident that this is not a topic that's been covered. I mean, obviously we can use keywords and we can just start searching on Google Scholar, but is there a better way to kind of go about that process?
I mean, not really. I mean, this process takes time. This is why we're encouraged to do like literature work at the start of a project, at the start of a PhD. And I used to work with a guy when I was a postdoc. I remember, like, very successful researcher, published many papers in Nature and Science, like one of the leading invertebrate biologists in the world at the time. And every time he started a new research project, he would go to the library. And back in the day when we would still actually go to libraries and photocopy like lots of research articles, he'd go to the library and he'd photocopy everything that had been written on the particular topic that he wanted to work on. And he'd end up with a pile of papers like on the floor of his office that he'd go through and read and throw around, and just determining, based upon what other researchers have done and what they've cited and the pieces of information that they've used, where it would be interesting for him to focus his efforts and energy. So that, I think, is what needs to be done, to actually work on these questions, to see like what other researchers are interested in learning about.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. All right, so Wally has jumped in here and asked the first question, so thank you so much. I encourage everyone to either ask their questions in the chat, or you can just open up your microphone and raise your hand. So he asked as follows: my idea before now on the subject of research gap is that a gap can ensue from the area of analytical tool or in the right area of coverage, right? I really longed for this webinar in order to broaden my horizon on this discourse. Thank you. I'm not sure I fully understand the question. A
gap can ensue from the area of analytical tool. Yeah.
So I guess maybe, if I understand correctly, he's saying that a gap can either be in the methodology, right, or in the subject matter. Right. It could be that, an area has been studied before, but not using certain methodologies. Or it could be that, the methodology is there and we're not creating any new methods, but we're actually, applying a method to a different circumstance and different scenario that it hasn't been applied to before. That's how I understand it, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like, one of the best pieces of advice I have for people trying to find a question that's going to be interesting and for them to spend time on in their own research is to read like what other researchers are talking about, especially in the discussion sections of their previous papers. I mean, people often give away future research directions or things that would be interesting to work on in their papers. And this is something that we also encourage people to do when writing their discussion sections. I mean, of course, talk about future research areas that you would like to see worked on, but make sure you cite, so that when people come back to your papers and see, Avi's written this in his discussion, I'm going to go off and work on that, they have to cite the original source. I mean, that's a slightly tangential thing to note, but to determine what would be interesting for you to work on, see what other people have raised as potential future research directions in their papers. So Go to influential people in your field, look at their papers, look at what they're talking about, and use that as a resource, again, as part of your literature work. Use that as a resource to find areas that would be useful for you to spend time and energy. If nobody else has talked about something, then probably it's not going to be a knowledge gap that will be of broad interest within your own research field.
Yeah, I want to add two points. Number to what Garrett's saying, and I agree wholeheartedly with his comments. Number one is look at the last 3 volumes. That's what I usually recommend. 3 volumes of the journal that you're considering, right? And ask yourself the following question. To what extent does my article engage in conversation or in dialogue with any of the articles that have been published in the last 3 volumes? If the answer to that question is, well, yes, actually, I'm building off someone else's methodology in order to come to a new point. Or yes, my subject matter looks at a previously discussed topic in this journal from a different light, and I'm going to quote some of those authors that have already published, well, then great. It's a sign that you're in the right place. If you're coming to do something totally new, to quote from scholars who have never been, cited in this journal before, you may need to, press pause and ask yourself, well, is it because I really have something to add and this is the perfect journal? Or maybe this isn't the right platform for me. I need to go somewhere else, and I need to try somewhere else where there's more, where I'm engaging in conversation. There's nothing that editors-in-chief love more than an article that furthers a conversation, a discussion about something they've already published in a critical and insightful and interesting way. So I highly recommend that. That's number one. Number two is I want to share a conversation that I had at the Frankfurt Book Fair, which I was at just 2 weeks ago, which is the largest book fair in the world, which has an entire floor of academic publishers who get together and talk about research publishing. And one of the publishers that was there is called PLUS. You may be familiar with it, the Public Library of Science. And they were talking about a really interesting question about whether there's room in research to publish new methodologies as their own publications, right? We're talking here about methodology versus content. So what they were asking themselves is, obviously when we produce new content, right? So that's a new publication. That's a classic how we understand things. But if I come up with a new method, right? The method in itself can have value, can be important. And if I've done that, that could be a gap that was discussed. And if I can do that, then maybe that itself deserves to be a publication. However, right now, publishers tend not to just publish new methodology as a publication. They're trying to experiment with this and see, is there a way that we can have this on its own? And then people can just comment on the methodology and whether they like it, don't like it, what the critiques they have on it. And I think that could really kind of move the entire publishing industry forward if we start looking at methodology as its own thing. But currently, I would say, when trying to define and come up with our research question, it can't just be that we're asking an old question using new methods. It may be in certain fields that's okay, but in most cases, we're really going to want to try and answer a new question that hasn't been answered before, and that's what makes the research novel.
And there are places where you can publish a methodology, like both on preprint servers and in journals like Nature Methods, for example. So there are a number of places where you could do that already. And one thing that's potentially good and interesting for colleagues listening to this would be like the use of a preprint of your article in draft form. If you're not sure how well it's going to be received or how interesting it is, but you've got some content and you've done some data collection, you've done some analyses, like why not preprint or publish a protocol if it's a new method and see what the community has to say. And that's one way as well that you can determine like how novel, how interesting the information that you've collected is going to be to a particular field. So preprinting can be useful in this respect as well.
Yeah. For those who aren't familiar with preprints, it's an ability to upload a draft of your paper that's not final, and to get reviews and comments and help from your peers in order to improve your article prior to submitting to a journal for publication. And whereas I would say 3 or 4 years ago, preprints were very much kind of on the fringe, meaning not what most people would do, not mainstream. Preprints are very quickly becoming an important part of the research process for all sorts of fun reasons that we won't get into today. But you know, as far as authors are concerned, I think it's a really, it should be welcomed with open arms, because it enables authors the ability to really get some initial feedback on what they've written and think through their ideas a bit further before they send it off to the publisher. And once they send it off to the publisher, the hopes is that, you know, you have a better chance of having your article accepted, because it's already been through some sort of you know, feedback process. Garrett, do you want to read out Reshmi's comment and question and see if we can tackle that one?
Sure. Sometimes the comments that come from the rejection give me alternative leads to move ahead with my topic. I have already progressed with my research. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Like the comments, and that's what I would also say to people who, you know, when you get rejected, when your article gets rejected, like often that can be quite a debilitating experience, can feel quite negative, but very often the comments that you get back from a journal, even when the paper gets rejected, can help you to improve and move on and you know, enhance the article for the next journal. Yeah, unfortunately, alternatively, I have also experienced rejection because the reviewer is unable to comment, being a scholar familiar working one way when I'm working at the intersection of two disciplines. How best to choose a journal that will be able to find a reviewer that's interdisciplinary in practice? Well, journal selection, very important. And I do strongly recommend that this is something that you think about at the very beginning of a research project. Definitely, like lots of people end up in the situation where they've written a paper and then they're like, where should I publish this paper? And that is a bit of a stretch. That's, I would say, often the kind of wrong way around to be working on these kind of things. Like, please try to target a journal at the beginning of the process in order that you can then answer questions like this from the outset. So how can I target a journal that will be interdisciplinary, will be good at finding reviewers for my particular research? Well, where are people leading your field publishing their research? Where are those papers in your field that are interdisciplinary? Where are they being published? I mean, you'll know this from your literature work. And again, this is a big reason why it's so important to carefully do the literature work at the outset of your research project, in order that you can identify knowledge gaps that will be effective for you, and also to determine journals that will be potential targets for the work at the end of the day. So I think
Reshmi, I want to add a hack. If you're not familiar with the hack, it's you know, a workaround, a way in through the back door, which I think I've seen can be successful. And that is, and I want to go back to my trip to Frankfurt 2 weeks ago, because I really just learned a tremendous amount there. The number one biggest issue, number one, for all journals currently is that they have a serious problem finding reviewers. And this is across all journals and across all publishers. And they just, because scholars are, you know, a lot of scholars just don't have time or are sick and tired of doing reviews because they have other things that they need to be doing. And they don't feel like they're getting proper compensation for it, all sorts of reasons. But journals don't have enough reviewers. So what happens? You could, I know I'm exaggerating here, but you could cure cancer forever, and the article may not get reviewed because they couldn't find people to review it. I mean, I'm saying it in jest, but I actually think it's a serious problem. So what's the hack? The hack is come with suggested reviewers already at the outset. I think, Garrett, we may even discuss this in our first session together. It sounds weird because it's like, well, aren't they supposed to be blind reviewers, right? And then like they'll know me. But you know, this is when you come with a list of 3 or 4 people that you know are in your field, you know, they respect you, they respect your research, they understand, you know, your field. You save so much time for the journal, for yourself, and in the end, it's best for everyone involved, because you'll get a better review, you'll get it faster, because you know that it's, you know, folks who really understand. Because, and I think you may have mentioned, sometimes the reviewers just don't get it. Like you read the review and you're like, they didn't understand what I was trying to say. Like, they don't get this field. And especially with interdisciplinary research, this can be a big problem. So come with a list, 3 or 4. These are obviously people who you should have a good relationship with, and it doesn't mean to be that you work together in the same department. That's not the idea. The idea is colleagues. You may not have never even met them in real life, but it's colleagues that you engage with or interact with online through listservs that you feel really will give you a real and fair assessment of your research because they understand the field. You do that, you help yourself out along with making, the journal's life easier.
It's a hack, but it's more than a hack. It's what successful researchers do. It's what successful publishing academics do. So 2 points to follow up on that, if I may. The first is that Avi mentioned that you can suggest reviewers for your papers, people that you have a good relationship with. And that's very important. If you have an abstract or some early stage information or a manuscript, recommend that you talk to people, send it to people, share it with people. Like, we teach this to early career researchers. Share your work with people in your network. Get comments, write to people and say, Dr. Staiman, would you be happy to comment on my paper? And then when you get positive comments back on your draft, you say in the next email, would you be prepared to act as a reviewer of this paper? Okay, you've got somebody lined up who would be a positive reviewer. And it's a hack, but it's also what people do, So put those names in your cover letter. And this is the other thing I want to say. I'm an editor at a journal with Taylor and Francis, have been for 18 years or more. Most researchers, when they submit papers, put a cover letter that says nothing. It just says, here's my paper, have a nice day, or something like that. That's a big wasted opportunity because editors read cover letters. You must put some information into the cover letter, why the work is important, how it fits with the journal, and who you would recommend as reviewers. Now, different publishers have different guidelines on this for editors. You may not be able to suggest reviewers in the manuscript submission system because lots of journals have done away with that, but you will be able to do this in the cover letter, and that goes directly to the editor. It doesn't come through the publishing company to the editor. So if you put 4 or 5 good suggestions, what if those people that you suggest are people that will already be happy to make the review based on what we were talking before? You can really accelerate and enhance the success of your manuscript by doing that.
Yeah. And Reshmi, I love your idea about the editorial board. That's another hack that I share in my workshops that I do, is look at the editorial board. First of all, there's a way to make sure that you're in the right place, right? Are these folks that you've never heard of before in your entire life? Well, maybe you should become familiar with their research because they're going to be the ones who are going to have an influence on whether your research is going to get published there or not. That's number one. Number two is if there are members of the editorial board who are writing in your field, make sure that you relate to their research if it's relevant. Don't just, put them in there for no reason. But if they have written and they're leading thought leaders in the field, make sure that you're giving them their due. Now, I want to state what I'm saying very clearly. I don't think that you should just, kind of flatter whoever's on the board, just, and say nice things about the research because you want to get in. But I do think that I have seen reviewers who it's fairly clear from their review that they're upset that they weren't quoted in the article more. So you do have to be aware and cognizant of that, of those sensitivities, to make sure that you're not missing out on, on important research that they're doing, and that because they're going to be the ones who are making the decisions. All right, we've got a question here from Wale, another question. So stemming from what I said earlier on as touching analytical tool and Avi's response methodology, a situation where previous studies used the hard format paper questionnaire in data collection as opposed to e-questionnaire. Can that be said to be a gap, knowing that fully well that e-questionnaire enhances data quality? Interesting. Okay, so I guess if I understand correctly, it's trying to understand if changing the methodology, even in a technical way, going from hard to digital is enough of a difference to say, okay, now I'm going to, run the same study, but running it with questionnaires online as opposed to, hard questionnaires, and seeing if that makes a difference. I don't know. I'm skeptical that that's going to be enough, unless that really is critical in order to, justify a new paper. But I'm curious what you think, Gareth.
I think it's going to be incremental. I would say that may warrant like an additional publication. Like I've changed the method slightly, or I'm, discovering something slightly different to what was previously published. Incremental publications are good, and that's the kind of nuts and bolts of our research careers. But I would encourage you to be looking for bigger steps forward, larger steps forward, because you could publish 10 papers a year at incremental research, or you could publish 1 paper per year, which actually is making a big impact. And of course, which is better for your career? It's a common question that we get, like, should I publish 1 high impact paper each year or 10 medium impact papers? I think the answer is relatively obvious to everybody. We're looking for questions that are broadly interesting. Have a look at what Nature and Science are publishing, those big international journals. They're looking for interesting, multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary research, those connections between different subjects that are interesting for readers. At the end of the day, a high impact journal is a magazine. It's trying to get as many readers interested as possible. And so that's what we're also looking for as researchers when we put together our projects.
Yeah. And I think that, to build on what Gareth's saying, I think it's really important that in terms of reputation, right? Most of the fields are quite small. So you don't want to be known as someone who tried, even if you weren't intentionally trying to republish an article in a different format, you don't want to develop a reputation as someone who's trying to kind of take their research and reformulate it and just publish it again. I've run into, and don't forget the other thing that's important. Don't forget that there is, you may get feedback about what is known as self-plagiarism, right? So if, let's say, you change one part of your research, you can't just copy and paste your previous study and try to republish it, because as soon as it goes through the plagiarism review, it'll say, oh, this is 80% similar to your last article, so we won't publish it. So don't forget that either way, you're going to have to rewrite what your study to be novel and to be different. So it's important that, so if you're already having to rewrite it, it makes sense that you're already doing new work as well. Okay, I do want to get to the research question, because I think that's probably on a lot of folks' minds here today. And I'm wondering, maybe let's start from the negative and build from that to the positive. Gareth, what is the most common issue you see with research questions, or the building out of research questions, that you find is most prevalent or most common among researchers? And maybe then we can kind of try to figure out how to go about avoiding that.
Yeah, I would say there are 2 things that kind of build on what we've been talking about before. Like, too ambitious would be one, and too narrow would be the other. And of course, lots of the second category get published. Too narrow, too incremental. We're going for that middle ground here. We're going for that question that's both attainable, interesting, and manageable with our research projects. Okay, don't forget that really the main way that papers get rejected often is because of issues in the methods section, and reviewers will look at your methods and they'll think this is not appropriate for this particular question, or this is too big of a tool to crack that small nut. So this is important, like focusing your question on something that's attainable, as we were talking about before.
I want to give one other suggestion, which is, and one other thing that I see quite often, is that the research question is solid, but the article, when all is said and done, doesn't properly answer the research question. right? Meaning, so we have this concept of what we wanted to check, and then we get excited by all sorts of, things along the way that we want to tell our readers about. But the reader is left at the end of the article saying, well, did you properly answer the question? Or what we see sometimes is, maybe there's a main question and then there are 3 or 4 kind of sub questions that come out of it. And you might have answered 1 or 2 of those in your research in a serious way. And then the other 2, you kind of, threw out a 1 sentence, response to. So my suggestion is, when you're all done, right, ask yourself, go through each and every paragraph and read them 1 at a time and say, does this paragraph help me to answer my research question? If the answer is no, cut it out. It doesn't mean that it's not important. It could be important in other, you may have gone, ahead to answer 1 question. You actually revealed that there's another issue that you want to address. Great. You can get another publication out of that potentially, right? Maybe that's something more modest. Maybe you can publish it as a note or as a review, but not as a full article, right? But you don't want to get too distracted with other interesting things so that you're not actually answering the initial research question that you set out to answer. Now, it's okay if your research question changes during your study, but by the time you get to writing your paper, you need to be super clear about what it is that you're, trying to answer. And then the rest of the article needs to kind of, lay that out. The other thing I would say is a great way to check this is your abstract. The abstract should directly answer your research question. It's not like a novel. Don't wait until the very end for a twist, a plot twist, a surprise, because you know what's going to happen. Garrett, the editor, or your editors are never going to get there. They're going to put the article down and say, I don't get it. I don't get how what they found has what to do with what they were looking to find, right? So you kind of need to just tell the biggest conclusion already in your abstract, which directly answers the research question, and make sure that's consistent throughout.
Yeah, there's a trick, isn't there, for writing abstracts? Like, put the time into it, because of course lots of people don't put a lot of time into writing their abstracts, and structure them around those 4 key questions. Like, what did you do? Why did you do it? What did you find? And what did you conclude? I mean, those are the questions that people need to have answered, not just in the abstract, by the way, but over the whole of the body of the paper. And keep it simple. I mean, people like to be told what they think they already know, and they will get confused if you suddenly make big leaps forward or jumps off in directions that they're not expecting. So yeah, these are key to structuring research papers. Why did you do the study? What did you do? What did you find? And what's the significance? What did you conclude?
Yeah. All right. Reshmi asks, I continue to ask questions in the hypothesis stage, based on which I start the analysis to get the findings. Doing this way, I haven't yet published, so I don't know if this way will be accepted when submitted. Your views, please.
Yeah, I have views on this. You shouldn't be modifying your questions based on the data that you're collecting. You should be formulating a question, a hypothesis, and then collecting data to test that hypothesis or not. Like, it's not going to work for you to start collecting data and then switch and change your hypothesis as you go along, I'm afraid. Okay,
yeah.
So
I think the challenge for researchers, maybe I'll try, Reshmi, I don't mean to speak on your behalf, but I'm curious, maybe this is something that researchers have experienced here in this virtual room today. Part of the problem, Garrett, that I see is that researchers set out to do research. Now, in the beginning, they don't know what the data is going to tell them. They don't know whether there's going to be a big novel, something brand new that's going to blow people away, or it's kind of just going to be inconclusive. There are plenty of studies that end up inconclusive or without any big bang at the end of the day. And I think the problem is that scholars know, well, if there isn't anything conclusive or anything really sharp and new, and so I've just spent a year doing a study which isn't going to get published. So there's really interesting conversations happening now in the publishing world about is there room and is there a place for publishing and making public as part of open access, especially, research that didn't go as planned, or that didn't give us the results that were conclusive, or that, that didn't show what we were hoping to, but maybe another researcher can learn from that experience and avoid making the same mistakes, or even if it wasn't a mistake, and get a publication out of it that way as well. That we shouldn't just be rewarded for research that ends up with, something totally brand new. Sometimes confirming what we already know is really important. So that's also something that I think is, again, it's still new, right? It's not how the research world is set up just yet, but I think there's an understanding that things need to change in order for researchers to, because it's so tempting. It's so tempting to be like, okay, now that I'm in the middle of my research, I'm going to go and, redo it in a way that's going to be packaged nicely and I can market to publishers, because otherwise they might not care.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, a lot of this, unfortunately, as we're learning in these discussion sessions, is about selling and marketing your research to journals. And is that a good thing? I'm not sure, like as a researcher myself, like whether that's the way that we should be thinking about our work. But unfortunately, there you have the clash between publishing, academic publishing, and research. And at the end of the day, editors care about readership. They care about people picking up the magazine, downloading the journal, like citing the papers. So they're going to be looking for research that they think is going to be attractive to readers. And if you know that as an author, then you can package your research in such a way that it's going to be more attractive to journal editors. And one of the ways to do that, of course, is to sell your work by looking at the bigger picture when you test questions in your own research field. I mean, if you tell us what your research fields are, what questions you're working on, and we can help you to package your questions in such a way that they'll be more interesting to journal editors. The example I always use in workshops that I do is my father. He's an atmospheric chemist. He published many papers in his career in field-specific journals, but only later in his career did he start talking about climate change with his research. And of course, he could have been talking about that for his whole career, but it wasn't such a thing like earlier in his academic career. But tying the work, tying the questions to those bigger ticket issues that lots of people care about, I think is one way that you can sell your work more effectively to academic journals.
Yeah, and I want to say one more word about the sales element of it. You're going to have most likely a very dry and pointed and specific research question, right? And that's exactly how it should be. It doesn't need to be jazzed up. However, there may be advantages, if you do it right, of making the title, when it's actually time to submit your article, to making your title a little bit more interesting and a little bit more appealing. So there's one example that kind of sticks out in my mind of a project that we translated. It was about evaluation assessments of government controllers, right? And seeing like how you best evaluate it. And the author realized, like, unless you're like a real freak about government, finance, or you really love, evaluation processes and methods, it's going to be a bit boring, that title, right? So she entitled her paper "The Cat with the Hats," from the famous Dr. Seuss Cat in the Hat books, and talking about how a controller has different roles they need to play within the government system and how the evaluation should take that into account. And I loved the creativity that she used to take her very clear research question, which she knew very well, but then transform it and take it to a place where I'm curious, right? I'm engaged, even if I I'm not, if I'm going through a pile of papers and everything's very dry, cut and dry and boring, all of a sudden I see the cat in the hats. I'm like, oh, that's interesting, right? That jumps out at me. I want to learn more. I'm more interested. In fact, I think, Garrett, there's been studies done about, creative title names can contribute to, editors engaging more deeply and making it further along the process. So be straightforward and boring the entire time, but when you're actually ready to take that step to send it out, speak to a few of your colleagues, test out a few working titles, see what people like the best, and make it interesting, exciting, engaging, sexy. Make it if you can make it connect to something that's happening in the world that's important, that people know about, that people are thinking about, then I think you really give yourself an opportunity to make your research question or your research topic stand out in a way, that if you would just kind of write the title in a bland way, it may or may not do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As you say, studies have shown, this is a great thing to say, research has shown short titles get more citations, and titles that are engaging and interesting get more citations. So you want to be interesting, you want to keep your titles short, and depending upon your subject area, journal editors are looking for what we call non-declarative titles in academic writing. And that's a title that tantalizes rather than gives away the answer. A title that gives away the answer is called a declarative title. That might be, this drug is the cure for cancer, to use Avi's example from earlier, whereas a non-declarative title, new research on drug X and its relationship to, X, Y, and Z. So people think, oh, that's interesting. I'm going to want to read more. I'm going to want to learn more. And this, by the way, this is why you've seen those diagrams for the shape of academic papers. I don't know if you've seen those diagrams, but they look like a pyramid upside down for the introduction. The methods and results, like with a narrow tube and then a pyramid the right way up for the discussion section. You need to start off your papers with the big picture. And a big mistake that lots of people make when writing about their research is they dive in straight away at the beginning of the introduction with the specific details of that particular study. And that will immediately lose you a lot of readers. So yeah, we've got lots of resources we can share with you about structuring academic papers and writing. And this is a topic that we'll talk about, I'm sure, in later events in this series as well, when we come to start talking about structure.
Yeah, so I think we're heading to the home stretch, and I want to encourage anyone who has any remaining questions, please do share them now, because we want to take advantage of the time that we have together. I apologize, we don't yet have the next topic ready up and ready to register, but I'm thinking, Garrett, that because of some of the interest here and also offline about how to go about, after you're done choosing your research topic, how to go about, because you suggested picking a journal already from the outset. So I think that might be a really interesting topic to explore in our next session. How do we go about, picking a research topic? I think that can be really important. So let's, definitely be on the lookout for an email, both from AJE, Research Square, as well as academic language experts, and you can sign up and register for our upcoming, monthly events. Yeah, okay. So any final questions? Kuan, when I submitted my first paper to Nature 18 years ago, Nature has taken the steps of the Korean Physical Society and the American Physical Society as a rejection, resulting in a lot of confusion. I'm not sure I fully understand your comment here, Kuan. I apologize. But I will, what I would say is that Nature rejects, 98, 99% of the submissions that they get. So you're in very good company. I think that Garrett is right. We should be looking at Nature and Cell and New England Journal of Medicine and some of these places kind of as the standard bearers for what really great research is. That being said, to hang our career on trying to get published in one of those journals may be a really frustrating experience, and especially if it's your first or second or third time trying to publish your article. My recommendation is always be, you will, if you aim for one level down from that, it's still highly competitive, but there's higher chances of being accepted. And you'll learn along the way, you'll learn the process. And then you'll be able to make intelligent decisions and determinations about where you want to publish in the future. But to try to expect that you're going to get your first article or one of your first articles published in Nature may be lacking. That being said, there are folks who are working really closely with really leading advisors, and you really, you kind of came across or due to your hard work have really done some wonderful things. So, and it may be worthwhile to actually, try for one of those top end journals. But just don't get hung up on it. I guess that's my point, is that expect to be rejected. Don't be upset if you are rejected, and keep in mind that the chances are you're not going to get accepted to one of those journals. But it's good to read them to be familiar with what's going on. Jason asks, should we submit an abstract to the editor to see if we should submit our manuscript to the journal?
This is a very, 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 very good idea, Jason. And higher impact factor journals will ask you for a pre-submission inquiry before making a full submission anyway. And I would say that this is an excellent thing to do for any article submission. Write to an editor. If you've got a target journal in mind, make a pre-submission inquiry, and there's no limit to the number of these that you can make. So if you've got a project and you think, where am I going to publish this? Make a target journal list, 5 journals, 10 journals, right? Before you begin to write, you know the result, you know the message, you know what your conclusions are, you know what the outcomes are of your experiment or of your study or of your research. I would then recommend that you make pre-submission inquiries. Before you start to write to editors, say, I've got this, would you be interested? And some of them will ignore you. Some of them will write back and say, no, but we have a sister journal that you may be interested in. And some of them will write back and say, great. And if they do, you've already got ahead of the game there. You've already gotten one step in to that particular journal because you already have an editor interested in your submission. Okay, so this is a great thing to do. And like I said before, you're under no obligation to actually make that submission. You can make as many pre-submission inquiries as you like. So great strategy. And it's a strategy, again, it's not really a hack. It's something that successful researchers do. So I recommend that you do it as well.
Yeah, and I just want to add that I'm gonna say something which sounds very weird, but sometimes the best answer that you can get is a no. And let me explain what I mean by that, is that you almost will never get a yes when you submit a pre-submission inquiry. You might get someone to say, yeah, we're interested, please send it along. You're never going to get someone who's going to say, yeah, we're going to publish that, right? Because they haven't seen your full article. Getting a no can save you 6 months of waiting and burning time, which I think is really important, is that you don't want to, if you upload it via the form in a typical way, and then they're looking for reviewers until it gets, and it gets lost between the chairs, and who knows till they get back to you and they forget to get back to you. And it could be that in a 1-minute email, the editor-in-chief could have said, well, that's not something that interests us. And you've just saved yourself 6 months. So I think that's another reason why to reach out. Gareth tried. Some people will, you may get, don't be upset if every once in a while an editor may write back to you and be like, well, submit it the way you're supposed to submit it. Don't send us an email. But that's okay. I don't think you need to be nervous about such a response. Submit it. If they say no, move on. And then you haven't burned important time and experience. Because the last thing that researchers want to do, and it's so frustrating, is a year and a half after they finished their research and wrote it up, now they're working on revisions. Now they finally get a response. They've forgotten what they've done already because it's been so long, and now they need to revisit it. And had you, just sent that pre-submission inquiry, you may have saved a lot of time. Let's finish this out with Reshmi. Before we do, Ilana, would you mind just bringing up the event that's coming up in 2 days? We'll share that in a minute. This might be an event that might be interesting for folks. But in the meantime, Reshmi, what about presenting the paper beforehand to department or conferences? Audiences are really helpful. 100%. This is something I think I love. The authors who I see the progress in what they do. They start with a conference paper. It's like an idea that's formulating, that's percolating in their head. And then they get really great feedback from the conference, and then they turn it into their article. Because it's almost as if you've done peer review, right? I mean, you haven't, in the sense that it still needs to go through the formal peer review. But I just think it's great. It's really great to be able to get some initial feedback and then kind of develop your article as you go along. I want to let Garrett respond to that, but just quickly before we finish here, Ilana is going to share a link. This is coming up in 2 days. Am I right about that? Yes, in 2 days, coming up on Wednesday. crafting a winning book proposal in 5 steps. So I don't know if anyone here is working on not just articles, but books. Books are different. They have a lot of unique characteristics to how to publish a book. This is an event that we're running together with Edance, and we encourage you to register, sign up, and join us for that. Just like all of our other events, entirely free. So if you have submitted a book in the past, you're working on a book now, or you're thinking about a book in the future, this is definitely an event for you, and we encourage you to come and sign up. So yeah, Gareth, back around to you. Any points about submitting, about getting feedback even before you send off the article to for review?
I think it's a great thing to do. Yeah, I'm just copying the link to that book proposal event. I think that's going to be really worth attending. Yes, absolutely, Reshmi. Of course, get feedback from your colleagues in your department, present at conferences, but with a word of caution, of course. You never know who's going to be in the audience at those pesky academic conferences. So you wouldn't want to give away too much if the paper's still in the process, in the works. Of course, one thing that you can do to get around that is to preprint your work before you go to the conference. And that way, if I'm in the audience and I see your presentation and I run off to my lab and, write up a quick paper, I can't do that because you've already pre-printed, you've ensured your primacy. And so one of the questions we often get about pre-printing, won't people steal my ideas? Well, of course, no, because the preprint is stamped with a DOI, a document object identifier. You're actually safer doing that if you're going to share your work out at those academic conferences and you haven't published it yet. So generally speaking, absolutely fantastic. Of course, get feedback, and and don't forget to attend the book workshop in just a few days. I'm going to be there, so I'll see you all.
Amazing. Gareth, as usual, thanks so much for joining me. I think it's really fun, these events, and also very informative. For everyone in our audience, thank you for taking time out of what I know is a very busy day. I know that it's beginning of semester, so good luck to everyone on your teaching this semester if you're teaching, or if you're lucky enough to have the semester off or have some free time with your research writing. And continue kind of paying attention and tuning in to our events. If you have individual questions, don't hesitate to be in touch with Gareth and I. I guess we'll share our emails here via the chat for anyone who does have an individual question that they want to get answered. And I really so thank you, Gareth. I always learn from you in these sessions as well. There's always more to learn, no matter how much time we spend and no matter how many articles we've looked at. So thanks, everybody. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you at future events.
Likewise. Have a great day. Good evening. Take care. Bye.
Cheers, everybody. Bye-bye.